Hi, on behalf of the Cambridge University Public Engagement Team, I would like to welcome you to the launch of Cambridge Creative Encounters Partnerships. I am Diogo Gomes, the Public Engagement Manager for the Clinical School in the School of Biological Sciences. Cambridge Creative Encounters was initiated in 2016 with a series of short films. Researchers worked with artists and filmmakers to create films about their research that were creative, accessible, and engaging. Since then, Creative Encounters got a step further by incorporating 3 more themes into this project. Very Shorts, a series of animated and illustrated GIFs, partnerships, media students from a local further education college paired up with researchers to produce a short film, and Behind the Curtains, where researchers explored and wrote a short play based on their research with professionals. Our showcase today is dedicated to partnerships, where a researcher, Dr. Alexandre Loktionov, an ancient historian with a particular interest in justice across Egypt and the Near East, collaborated with the creative media student Skye Putwain. The short film they produced together is the result of this collaborative process of discussion and exchange of ideas during spring and summer 2020. As part of the showcase, we also included some short interviews with Alex and Skye, giving a deeper insight into their work, the creative process, and collaboration. Throughout this viewing, you can ask questions to Alex, Skye, and the public engagement team over our Twitter account, @ChemUniEngage. Without further ado, enjoy Cambridge Creative Encounters Partnerships. Thank you.
My work tracks long-term changes in ancient Egyptian justice, and I really do mean long-term, from just after 3000 BC to just before 1000 BC, so that's a 2000-year period. The unique richness of Egyptian texts gives us fascinating insights into how justice started out and developed in one of the world's oldest civilizations, how the first specialized legal officials emerged, how different types of court came into being and then became obsolete, and how strategies for dealing with offenders evolved. Much of this long-term judicial evolution was driven by relatively short periods of profound disruption, which would end but produce a permanent new normal. For example, in the late 3rd millennium BC, various political crises led to Egypt fragmenting, with the previously united country turning into many city-states that frequently fought each other. Justice adapted to the new, decentralized reality, and even when the country reunited, the judicial landscape had changed. Similarly, 500 years on, in the mid-2nd millennium BC, there was more upheaval when much of Egypt was taken over by foreign rulers with roots in the majority Semitic territories to the northeast of Egypt. They brought technological and social innovations, some of which concerned justice. Even when these foreign rulers subsequently fell from power, many of their changes remained in place. So as you watch the film, pay particular attention to these major upheavals. Of course, just like the Egyptians, we too have now entered a period of rapid change, where existing orthodoxies are being challenged. If the Egyptian experience is anything to go by, the crisis is going to end, but many of its consequences, whether we like it or not, will remain. And with that, I hope you enjoy the film.
My name is Skye, and today I will be discussing the 2D animated short film I collaborated on for Cambridge University's Creative Encounters project. I created this film with an Egyptologist who specialises in ancient Egypt's justice system, which is the subject matter that our film was based upon. My collaborator and I dissected the film into 5 periods. the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, and lastly, the New Kingdom. The first act of the film paints an overview of how the legal system was formed, discussing the emergence of the first lawyers seen in the Old Kingdom, to then showing the progression of how codification and punishment were utilised in the New Kingdom. The second act of the short film expands upon these 5 periods in more depth, detailing the layers of how specialised legal officials were formed, the foreign interactions that led to ancient Egypt being conquered, and the ways in which these events impacted the legal system. The final act of the film explores the brutality and mutilation techniques which became prevalent in the New Kingdom, and how they were influenced by previous periods, effectively changing the legal system forever. To establish the evolution of ancient Egypt's justice system, we have to reflect upon the 5 key periods of ancient Egyptian history. The first chapter of this story begins in a time known as the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was a unitary state. This means that its formal government was highly centralised. This structure developed as a result of several smaller polities coming together at the end of a time known as the pre-dynastic period. The most powerful role in ancient Egyptian society during the Old Kingdom and also later was the Pharaoh. This principal title embodies this unitary state, guaranteeing both earthly and divine protection. The Old Kingdom may be regarded as the most transformative period in ancient Egyptian history, as the foundations of justice and pharaonically controlled statehood were introduced. Pharaoh was at the top of the social hierarchy. He was the lord of 2 lands, one being the Nile Delta in the north, called Lower Egypt, and the second being the Nile Valley in the south, called Upper Egypt. An interesting fact about the Upper and Lower Egypt during the Old Kingdom is that each of them retained their own symbols, traditions, and gods. The administrative structure of both locations was made up of the administrative regions and was centred around a town. In these towns, mayors and local governors were responsible for taxation on behalf of the central state. Their purpose was to collect revenue from nomes. These were territorial divisions in ancient Egypt. The tax revenue collected by these mayors and governors from nomes went towards financing royal building projects ordered by the pharaoh. Egypt's prized pyramids of Giza are an example of royal building projects financed by heavy taxation. The Old Kingdom was politically and economically centralised. This meant the core of the state was wealthy, and those living there were more likely to be literate. An administrative core around the city of Memphis formed at this time. This is where senior officials were based and where cases were judged. However, the issue with centralisation was the impact it had upon those living in the provinces away from this core. These citizens were poor and were most likely illiterate, which created an unbalanced society. The decentralisation of the Old Kingdom was due to the shift in power between provincial administrators and the pharaonic government. The costly royal projects and demands from the pharaoh, as seen with Pepi II's extraordinary 94-year reign, led to economic strain. This caused many administrators to lose faith in the system, as they rarely visited the administrative corps, giving their offices to their successors. The administrators gained provincial revenues for themselves, which concluded with the pharaonic government disintegrating as they no longer received political and financial support from the whole country, resulting in decentralisation. Now our story continues into Chapter 2, delving into a time known as the First Intermediate Period. After ancient Egypt decentralised in the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period became divided into essentially independent microstates. These were clustered around former provincial capitals. The local nomarch, meaning the governor of an ancient Egyptian nome, and his officials all theoretically accepted government law of the pharaoh. However, in practice, they had absolute control over their territory. The territorial control that the magnate possessed over their land created a shift in power, leading to social and economic changes, as now those living in the periphery were given their share of wealth, where it remained in its entirety. Another change that occurred during the First Intermediate Period was the increase in artwork and its standard in comparison to that of the Old Kingdom. Junior provincial administrators began to build more elaborate tombs and write complex inscriptions. This shows that the First Intermediate period gave new opportunity for provinces as they acquired more wealth. This increase in local power shows that more people, like lower-level officials, were developing skills of basic reading and writing. Local officials were trained, which created stability in the provinces. During this period, because of decentralisation, there was no longer an administrative core being dominated by local legal officials. Instead, the rise of literate individuals who specialised in justice rose, and created a more nuanced and, in places, professionalised legal system in comparison to that of the Old Kingdom. The decentralisation ended around 2050 BC. At this point, microstate Thebes gained influence and eventually was able to create and lead an alliance of minor rulers who eventually conquered the whole of Egypt, initiating the next chapter of our story, a period known as the Middle Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, two things had reformed. The state had been reunified and the administrative core was re-established in the Nile Delta. However, certain changes made in the First Intermediate period remained. Provinces also remained wealthier and became far more independent. The Middle Kingdom, being centralised, allowed the inequalities between the core of the state and the periphery to decrease massively since the Old Kingdom. Another development that is seen from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom is the decrease in the pharaonic government's engagement in monumental royal building projects. Another way in which the Middle Kingdom progressed in its justice system was the introduction of defined law known as HEP. This gave judicial officials the opportunity to now be able to look up how certain cases should be handled before they reached a definitive decision. We will discuss this law in more detail later on in the film. There's also evidence to show that during this time, literature may have progressed further. The next period in our story is known as the Second Intermediate period. Ancient Egypt was transformed at this time, as the foreign interactions that occurred led to many changes in its justice system. The Semitic people from Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel, collectively known as the Hyksos, invaded ancient Egypt. This led to war and political instability. Once the Hyksos fully conquered northern Egypt, they became fond of the pharaonic system put in place and made themselves pharaohs. The Hyksos strongly favoured codification, which is the process of arranging laws according to a system of action and consequence. While they are now most famous for introducing the Egyptians to horse-drawn chariots, the Hyksos added much to the legal system using strict force and punishment. A legal idea called protasis apodosis was brought in by the Levantine origin people known as the Hyksos. This triggered a change in the justice system and meant that a king would decree, if a person carried out X, that person would suffer Y. This principle was commonly used throughout ancient Egypt after the Hyksos invasion. To conclude the Second Intermediate period, the Semitic laws put in place after the Hyksos conquered the land were extremely brutal, using death and mutilation as a form of punishment, increasing the use of violence to gain justice. The period discussed here is known as the New Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, the Hyksos who previously conquered ancient Egypt were driven out, and the country was now free, united once more under a single pharaoh. As the New Kingdom continued, Egypt began to expand its territory, stretching from Nubia, or modern-day Sudan, across to Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. In comparison to the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom was vastly different in terms of law and order. Specialised legal officials introduced in the First Intermediate period remained, and new written laws and codification had been implemented into the justice system, continuing from that period. The Second Intermediate period Semitic laws placed in society emphasised the impact of mutilation and violent punishment towards crime, which continued and was adopted in the New Kingdom. Now that the New Kingdom regulated and recorded its justice, the production of complex legal transcripts flourished. These included descriptions of tomb raiders being violently tortured for confessions, mutilation of people who broke oaths, and executions of those who plotted and conspired against the pharaoh were sentenced to execution. These are only a few examples expressing the harsh, violent laws and regulations introduced in the Second Intermediate period that continued into the New Kingdom. To delve deeper into the history that formed the evolution of ancient Egypt's justice system, we have to understand the structures, laws, and punishment that shaped its foundations. Reflecting upon the Old Kingdom's justice system, one of the most important elements to look at is the court structure. In the Old Kingdom, they created a broad court. This was a large open court or roofed hall in a temple. Its purpose was for judging in the administrative cause. Old Kingdom officials who worked at the broad court were given specific titles depending upon their role. For instance, some were called Enforcer of Judging in the Broad Court, Enforcer of Judging in the Royal Broad Court, and Overseer of Judging of the Broad Court. 6 officials were also titled Director of Broad Court. The collapse of the Old Kingdom's justice system comes down to 2 things: the central judicial institutions of the old administrative corps becoming non-existent, and the provinces taking control of the administrative affairs, which meant the centralised judicial institutions declined. Now looking at the Middle Kingdom's justice system in more detail, one of the developments that occurred was the increase in literature. During this time, a new judicial concept was put in place, known as law. The evidence of this law was closely linked to wisdom literature and tomb autobiographies. Similar to the Old Kingdom, titles were used to give roles and responsibilities to those giving the laws. The overseer of judicial hearing and dividing could also be given the title one who gives laws. Allusions to law were also inscribed upon seals. This shows their significance in administration at the time. These laws were also used to determine detention, which gives evidence that they may have been the principal feature of penal administration. The Middle Kingdom also introduced a list of titles whose holders focused only on justice: Overseer of the Department of Judges, Overseer of Judges of the Chamber of Procedure, Deputy of Judges, Chief of Judges, Follower of Judges, Scribe of Royal Documents of Judges, Great Scribe of Judging, Chief of Great Scribe of Judging, Scribe of Judges. These lone titles represent 48% of the Middle Kingdom's entire dataset of judicial officials, in comparison to the 0% in the Old Kingdom. This means that while the Old Kingdom officials never specialised solely on justice, nearly 1 in 2 Middle Kingdom officials did. Reflecting upon the First Intermediate Period and its impact on the Middle Kingdom, we witness how the fragmentation and decentralisation impacted the periphery legal authority in the periphery, as it became taken over by local legal practitioners. This meant that literature, training and scribalism increased as the resources to the periphery grew. It is in this context that we witness the appearance of law, which may have become written law, reflecting the growing sophistication of literature culture within ancient Egypt's justice system. When discussing the terms used in justice system in this period, 2 that occurred were called hearing and dividing words. Hearing was defined as what was heard during a proceeding. This was an active process leading to a decision. Dividing words was defined as the actual act of passing definitive judgment. It was important in the Old Kingdom, but mostly merged with the hearing by the Middle Kingdom. To summarise the changes between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, there were 4 key changes that occurred. The first being that the former judicial institutions used in the Old Kingdom administrative corps died out. The second being the emergence of codified law, which influenced some written judicial decisions as it was introduced in the Middle Kingdom. The third being that the judicial officials became more specialised, often having links to justice. The fourth being that the scribes became more significant in the Middle Kingdom. In short, the Middle Kingdom features the return of a centralised state. A change that occurred due to the return of centralisation was the emergence of new specialised judicial officials, and they could become effective tools in the new state, increasing control over the provinces by spreading the application of Pharaoh's law. Centralised governments also saw the increased importance of codified law as giving all provinces a single set of rules, which would uphold a common set of principles by local administrations. This meant local officials shared a nationwide bureaucratic parlance. Before we delve into the layered punishments and laws of the New Kingdom, we will have a brief, summarised overview of the key elements that made up the Old Kingdom, First Intermediate Period, and the Middle Kingdom's justice system. The elements that formed the Old Kingdom's justice system were the defined judicial corps, weak links between royal institutions and local village councils in the periphery, some practitioners who focused on local justice matters, but usually outside the recorded sphere of formal state bureaucracy. The elements that formed the First Intermediate Period's justice system were the collapse of defined judicial corps, centralised institutions being shut, expansion of provincial resource availability due to the collapse. The elements that formed the Middle Kingdom's justice system were the erasure of clear boundaries between the periphery and original core justice systems, the extinction of many judicial institutions, leaving only honorific titles as relics of bygone age, specialised judicial officials emerging with common professional identities, the legal principles of law being introduced, lastly, a more unified system which included some recorded justice. Now we arrive at the last section in our story of ancient Egypt's justice system. To begin delving into the details of the New Kingdom's structure of law and punishment, we will be reflecting upon the transformative increase of violence and the specified force that was used against convicts, which was at least in part connected to the Hyksos invasion in the Second Intermediate Period. After the Second Intermediate Period passed and the Hyksos fled, the New Kingdom's justice system was effectively transformed as it retained influence from the Hyksos punishment techniques, which favoured violence. The New Kingdom's justice system can be broken down into three key features. The first being torture and corruption. Beatings and contortion of limbs were frequently used methods of torture that were seen in court examination. Torture was also utilised to draw confessions and bribery from people, which was perfectly legal, but it could also be associated with corruption and bribery. The second dimension of the New Kingdom's justice system focuses on execution, mutilation, and banishment. In extreme cases, for instance, if a criminal were found guilty of treason or violation of sacred property, they would most likely be executed. The technique used to do this was mainly impalement, although burning was also used in some cases. If a criminal were to try conspire and plan to kill the pharaoh, they could be coerced into taking their own life, which was seen as the worst fate. Mutilation laws and techniques can be shown through the oaths found in past documents. A translated example states, "As Amun endures and as the ruler endures, if I speak falsehood," replaced by other offence if appropriate. "May there be cut off my nose and ears, me being banished to Cush." To give geographical context, Cush was an ancient kingdom in Nubia, located in the Sudanese and southern Egyptian Nile Valley, and was used as a place of banishment where convicts were sent to work in labour camps. Mutilation in the New Kingdom's justice system was very extreme. It could consist of beatings and open wounds. For example, a provision in a royal decree against embezzlement stated, "Laws will be enforced against him by beating him with 200 blows and 5 open wounds, together with exacting labour." In common cases, the ears and nose of a convict would be cut off. This was particularly traumatic for the individual, but effective in punishment. The nose was associated with the breath of life, and the ears represented the connection of wisdom and divine granting of requests between the human and the gods. If these were severed, the convict would be cut off from any connection with the gods, leading to social stigma and outcast, which triggered fear and prevented crime. Due to these mutilations, convicts would also suffer psychological effects and a high risk of infection. To expand upon the extremity of punishment in the New Kingdom, Egyptian convicts would work underground in gold mines, under very harsh conditions, in chains and being frequently beaten, which led to them dying of injuries. A Greek historian, known as Diodorus Siculus, explained how the convicts desired death, as it can't have been worse in their eyes than the ongoing horrible conditions and treatment they would face. Moving into the final dimension of the New Kingdom's justice system, we witness the use of renaming and psychological belief-based sanction. Renaming of a convict would create permanent damage, as their identity was fundamental to the individual once they progressed into the afterlife. To lose your name was to lose part of your being, causing irreparable harm to the existence in the afterlife. Lastly, the psychological sanctions caused by the facial mutilation and renaming, in order to prevent convicts from communicating with the gods, created vulnerability. These sanctions excluded convicts from established realms of divine protection and from social norms associated with it. To conclude our story, the evolution of the justice system within ancient Egypt was a chain of varied changes and events throughout the periods. The Old Kingdom developed the foundations of justice and progressed from a unitary state to being decentralised. The First Intermediate Period fragmented the land into microstates, and we witness a shift in power as minor rulers conquered and slowly reintroduced centralisation. The Middle Kingdom then extended the use of literature and scribal culture, expanding the wealth from the periphery, even as it became centralised again, and using a stronger system with more economical equality across regions. Then, the Second Intermediate Period shows foreign interactions with the Hyksos. Their influence likely led to an increase in violence within the system, which created a drastic shift as the harshness and extremity of punishment increased. Lastly, we come to the New Kingdom, which saw territorial expansion. The use of codification, torture, mutilation, and banishment dominated the justice system. Overall, we can witness the progression of how decentralization and foreign interactions in ancient Egypt led to a more brutal, specialized, and structurally regulated justice system.
I hope you enjoyed our Cambridge Creative Encounters partnerships, and we now have the chance to hear from our researcher Alexandre Loktionov and the creative Skye Putwain that collaborated on this project. Hi to you both, and I'll start with Skye first. And the question is, how was it working with a researcher, with Alex, and what did you value most in your collaboration?
Working with a researcher, usually when I create anything, it tends to be quite independent. So having that collaborative side was very helpful, because I could kind of somewhat depend on somebody to kind of feed me information and always get feedback, etc. So that was helpful, and I think I also learned a lot, honestly, and that was it was nice to not only just be creative in something, but also have an actual source to kind of draw off, rather than just making anything really. And value-wise, what I value the most, not too sure. Probably, I'd say I valued the kind of when it comes to the creative process, I valued the constant kind of development of it. So I liked how we were always kind of fleshing out the project and adding to it and changing parts of it, and basically just developing it.
And what did you need to know from Alex when you first started your creative process, and what were your tools to interpret his research?
Well, tool-wise, I was given a lot of written work to read, so just to kind of and then highlight important facts, dates, etc. And I have barely any knowledge on the subject, so for me I learned a lot, but I thought it was interesting, and that's why I chose the subject matter, because it's something I actually have an interest in. So that was learning wise. I had to absorb a lot of information, but I could always go back on it and read through it, and I tended to. So there was I think it was a document of different texts from the different historians and also Alex himself, and just kind of dissecting it, picking out parts that I found most useful, and then trying to compress it into something that I could create. So whether that was being particular with dates or with the setting or laws or whatever it was tended to be breaking it down. Basically I had to break down the text I was given and just put it in a way that made sense, not just for Alex or myself, but for other people, so it was accessible for more than just one type of person, or if that makes sense.
And Alex, how was it working with Skye?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just have to say a really huge thank you to Skye, and also to Creative Encounters for making this happen. It's been a real privilege and an honor to be part of this. I think one of the things which you sometimes miss as a university researcher is interaction with people who are outside of that quite narrow academic bubble. Egyptology, I think, by anybody's standards, is a fairly esoteric discipline, or at least can be that. You spend a lot of time working with texts that really very few people are able to read and understand. You then maybe publish something and engage in academic debate with maybe 3 or 4 other people in the world. And that can be, it can be uplifting in a way, but also I think it's important to be mindful that there are actually much larger audiences out there that we have to engage with. And that was about working with that. Obviously, here is somebody with a very different background and a very different skill set who is able to bring a very different kind of perspective on the project. So I was really able to understand and to learn about how we can make these things accessible to audiences who probably are interested in ancient Egypt. I think there are a lot of people out there who have that general interest, but who would not necessarily be drawn to ancient Egyptian law. I think that it's fair to say that ancient Egyptian law isn't something that immediately attracts attention. So it was really fantastic to get Skye to bring about change there.
And you have already partly answered this question actually, but I also was wondering, what were your expectations before you started the project, and did you already have a particular style in mind or a level to pitch your research? And the key thing is, did this change afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I went into this really with an open mind. My main objective was to have something, to produce something, and I kept saying that. I mean, Skye, you'll remember me stressing this point from an early stage. We have to get something. I don't mind actually what it is. I thought maybe it would be a kind of a mini game or something. That was my kind of initial thought. But once Skye said that, what she's best at is animation and making basically movies, I thought great. Because from my perspective, what really matters at this point isn't necessarily the type of media that we generate, but actually just being able to generate something that is of a standard that is, obviously both very high, but also approachable and accessible, because there's just nothing out there. There are, various Egypt-inspired works of fiction, shall we say, films like The Mummy or whatever, where Egyptology is really very distorted. Or then there are academic articles where there is no real effort to be accessible. So my aim was to have something in that middle space, something that would be both Egyptologically very rigorous and which, if necessary, could be defended by peer-reviewed articles and whatever, but that also would be of relevance to the average human in the street. And in the end, by working with Skye, it became clear that the avenue down which we should go would be a film, and an animated film. I think also the fact that we were doing this in lockdown made that decision easier. And in the end, I think it all worked really well, and I'm excited about the future audiences that we're going to be able to unlock. And I just really also want to emphasize this point about lockdown. I think the conditions in which we were doing these projects are obviously unprecedented and really tough. And I'm so grateful to Skye and to Cambridge Creative Encounters for keeping the faith and in making that happen. I'm sure it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. And it was such a pleasure working with you. And we hope to work with you again in the future.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed Creative Encounters Partnerships. We'll continue to take questions over Twitter. Thank you so much.